They say that in the town of Imole, the town whose very name meant light, there was once a time when the wisest man in the market was also the most celebrated. His name does not matter. What mattered was what he carried: knowledge. He knew when the rains would come and when they would refuse. He knew which roots healed fever and which ones hastened death. He knew the histories of 7 generations before him, and he kept them alive in his mouth, the way a mother keeps a child alive in her arms, carefully, deliberately, with great love. When he spoke, the market went quiet. That was a long time ago. It began, as most disasters do, with something small. A young man came into Imole from the outer roads. He had no trade, he had no lineage worth speaking of in the market. What he had was a drum, and the shamelessness to beat it at any hour, in any manner, for any reason, whether the rhythm made sense or not. His name was Ogboro. Ogboro could not read the sky for rain. He did not know the healing roots from the poisonous ones. Ask him the history of the town and he would laugh in your face and say, what is history feeding anyone? He said this so loudly and so often that people began to nod, not because he was right, but because his drum was loud, and loud things, over time, begin to sound like truth. The children gathered around him first, as children do around noise, then the idle youths. Then slowly, and this is the part the elders found most alarming, even some of the educated ones began to drift toward the sound. At least he is entertaining, they said. At least he does not pretend, they said. At least he is real, as though reality had never before included the ability to think. There was an elder in Imole, a man who had traveled, who had studied, who had returned to the town with his hands full of hard-won understanding. His name was Ogbologlo, which the children had already shortened to that serious man. One afternoon, Ogbologlo stood in the center of the market and said what many had been thinking, but nobody had been saying. "What is happening to this town?" he asked. "We are celebrating a man who beats a drum he does not understand, and ignoring the farmer who has fed us for 30 years. We send our children to school, and when they return with knowledge, we ask them why they are not as rich as Ogbero. We have an Olodo Uprising in our hands, and we are treating it like a festival." The word fell on the market like a stone on still water. Rings spread in every direction. Some people nodded, but many others were angry, very angry. "Who is Ogbologlo to call us Olodo?" shouted a woman who had 12,000 cowries in cloth savings and 4 children who had dropped out of school to hawk wares. "Did his education put food on my table? Is he jealous of Ogbero's drum? Perhaps if he learned to dance, people would listen to him." And Ogbero himself, who had been listening from the shade of a mango tree, said nothing. He did not need to speak. The crowd was doing his work for him. The oldest woman in Imole sat under the Iroko tree at the edge of the market. She had seen 73 rains come and go. She had buried 2 husbands and outlived 3 kings. When the noise of the Ogbologbo argument reached her, she did not stand. She simply said to whoever was close enough to hear, "This is the 2nd time." Her granddaughter looked up. "Second time for what, Mama?" "The 2nd time the town has done this," the old woman said. "The first time was when your grandfather was young. In those days, it was not Ogbero. It was the men who found a way to take money from strangers in faraway lands by writing letters that were full of beautiful lies. They came back to the town rich. They built big compounds. The young men saw them and said, "Why should I farm? Why should I study? Why should I suffer in school for years when lies can make me wealthy in months?" She paused. "I watched those men," she continued. "I watched where they ended. Most of them did not end well. A few became so ashamed they could not look their own children in the eye. And the ones who survived, do you know what they said to their children? Go to school, learn a trade, do not do what I did." The granddaughter was quiet for a moment. "So what happened? How did the town recover?" The old woman looked at her for a long time. Slowly, very slowly, and not all of it recovered. Now, here is the part of the story that Ogbologbolo did not say in the market, but that everyone in Imole knew in their chest. The chief of Imole, the man who sat in the big compound at the top of the hill, who controlled the roads and the tariffs and the schools and the town crier, the chief himself had never finished his schooling. This was not a rumor. This was a matter that had been argued in the market for years. Scrolls were produced. Scrolls were disputed. Witnesses were called. Witnesses changed their story. The argument went in circles so long that eventually people became too tired to follow it, and the chief remained in his compound at the top of the hill. But a child who sees his father eat with his hands will not understand why he is being scolded for doing the same. Every time Ogbero beat his drum and the crowd cheered, there was an unspoken message in the air of Imole. The biggest compound in this town belongs to a man who did not finish school, who has never been made to account for anything, and who is still here. What exactly are we teaching our children when we tell them that learning is important? What are we pointing to as proof? Ogbologbolo knew this. He had known it for years, but he had made the mistake of pointing at Ogbero's drum when he should have pointed at the hill. Meanwhile, the children watched everything. They watched Ogbologbolo argue and be mocked. They watched Ogbero dance and be celebrated. They watched the teacher at the school earn less in a full moon than Ogbero earned in a single afternoon of drumming. They watched the best student in their class receive a small ribbon at the end of the year, while the loudest boy at the market received a bolt of cloth, palm wine, and cheers that shook the rafters. They were not foolish, these children. That was the tragedy. They were watching very carefully. They were learning. The question was simply, what were they learning? Some of them, the stubborn ones, the ones with fire that could not be extinguished by what they saw, kept reading their books by lamplight long after their parents had gone to sleep. They kept asking their teachers the questions that teachers love but are rarely asked. They competed in knowledge contests that nobody in the market attended. They won prizes that nobody in the market celebrated. They were out there. They always had been. But whether their number was growing or shrinking, whether Imole was slowly tilting toward them or slowly tilting away, this the story cannot yet say. But Ogbololo understood something else too, something he rarely spoke of aloud, perhaps because it was the most painful truth of all. Long before Ogbero arrived in Imole with his drum, there had been another promise in the town. It stood on a hill overlooking the market, built of red earth and white chalk, with windows that faced the morning sun. It was called the school. The elders told their children, "Study here and you will eat." And for a long time, this had been true. The brightest children climbed the hill every morning with slates under their arms. They learned numbers and histories and the names of distant places. They studied by lantern light and returned years later with certificates wrapped carefully in cloth. Some became teachers, some became healers, some built roads and bridges, and the town prospered. But slowly, almost too slowly to notice, something changed. The roofs of the school began to leak. The teachers waited longer and longer for their pay. The graduates returned home carrying certificates that nobody seemed to need. One young man studied for 17 years and came back to the market looking for work. He found Agbero earning more in a single afternoon of drumming than he could earn in a month. A young woman became the best student in the history of the school. The town congratulated her with a handshake and a ribbon. That same evening, Agbero performed a dance so foolish that people laughed until they cried and rewarded him with enough cowries to buy 2 goats. The children watched. And children, contrary to what adults believe, are excellent economists. They pay close attention to incentives. They observe what is praised and what is ignored. They notice who struggles and who succeeds. They do not always do what they are told. They do what appears to work. So when the elders asked, "Why do our children no longer value knowledge?" the children, had they been allowed to answer honestly, might have replied, "We watched." For perhaps the tragedy of Imole was not that the children had forgotten the value of knowledge, it was that the town itself had stopped proving it. The last time anyone checked, Agbero's drum was still going. Ogbologbolo was still in the market, still arguing, though his voice was hoarser now and the crowd around him smaller. Some said he had grown bitter. Others said the bitterness was just what truth looks like when it has been ignored long enough. The old woman still sat under the iroko tree. She was not worried, exactly, but she was watching. The chief was still in his compound at the top of the hill, and the children of Imole, those precious, watchful, impressionable children, were still deciding. Every day, with everything they saw celebrated and everything they saw ignored, they were casting a quiet vote for the kind of town Imole would become. The war is not over. In fact, in some ways, it has barely begun. They say a town that forgets how to think does not fall all at once. It falls the way a great tree falls in the dry season. First one branch, then another, until one morning the children wake up and ask, "Was there ever a tree here at all?" And the elders, if there are any left who remember, will say, "Yes, yes, there was, and it was magnificent." And the children will nod and go back to the drum. For Imole, and for everywhere that looks like her.